Thanks, Nicola. And yes, I'd like to also acknowledge the fact I'm on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's great to be here today, and thanks to the Parliamentary Research Service, particularly Nicola and Anita, for facilitating this project. I'm very happy to do this. I think it's a great example of research outreach. This paper comes from the product of various research that I've been undertaking over several years, so it's nice to be able to bring it together in the paper and present it here today. I'm going to try and limit my talk today to about 20 minutes, if I can, to leave time for Q&A. I'll do my best to do that, but I will try and speak a bit quickly to get through the slides to try and meet that time frame. First, a couple of caveats. I'm not coming here today to propose a silver bullet. I'm not going to prescribe one particular approach to issues relating to rural and regional New South Wales. The aim of this paper and this project is to set out the broader scale context. Now, I think that's important because what I think there is in this field in particular, and this is especially associated with the COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 period, is that there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of anecdotal noise. We hear stories of someone moving from Mossman, going to Bellingen, setting up a crypto trading platform, and they're working from home, and we go, oh, that's a future for regions. And it's a very alluring narrative in many respects, but kind of, as I'll say in my remarks today, it's a quite simplistic narrative. I think the issues facing rural and regional New South Wales are increasingly complex. They involve an interplay between demographic trends, a very rapidly changing economic environment, and a heightened need to undertake issues around sustainability and climate change centrally in our planning. And that's the sort of, I guess, the take-home theme that I'll underline today in my remarks. Just as background, this gives a context of population change over the past 2 decades in rural and regional New South Wales. The data set that I've used in this presentation derive originally from the ABS or from the Department of Planning and the Environment, and I've tweaked it to take out the major urban centres of Wollongong and Newcastle. So it's when you see Hunter and Illawarra, Shoalhaven there, it takes out those major population centres. So it refers to the rural parts of those regions. And the story here, there's just a couple of, I think, interesting trends we can see in the data here of population over the 2-decade period to where we are now. Firstly, there's obviously a coastal-inland dichotomy. I think that's not necessarily news to anyone here, but I think what's interesting is that far west New South Wales has fallen in population, but the other inland regions, you can see there, Riverina, Murray, New England, Northwest and Central West Orana, have all maintained their population over this period. So it's not a story of decline, it's a story of maintaining population in very rapidly changing economic circumstances. The coast has grown. If you'd asked me before I compiled this data what would have been the fastest growing part of New South Wales, I would have suggested North Coast. It doesn't come out in this data, I think, because what we're seeing here, when we take out Newcastle and Wollongong, we're seeing the spillover from those major cities into the rural parts of Hunter and Illawarra, and that has driven very rapid population growth in those areas. So let's think about these demographic trends before, during and after the pandemic. The story of demographic trends in New South Wales, when we think of it in terms of Sydney versus the rest, is very much a story of Sydney continuing to grow largely on the back of international migration, but losing people through domestic migration to other parts of Australia. And the different regions of New South Wales have benefited in varying ways to those shifts. Interestingly, there's a stat on this slide here which I calculated in the context of this report. I hadn't seen it before, which is that of the people leaving Sydney, the domestic migrants leaving Sydney for other parts of Australia, 45% of them end up in rural and regional New South Wales. So around half of the people who routinely leave Sydney, and that statistic has stayed remarkably steady for a couple of decades. So the people leaving Sydney, about half of them end up in different parts of the state. Now, a lot to the coastal areas and to central West Orana, particularly the high amenity regions around Dubbo, but also Orange and Bathurst. But also the other part of that is that in the regions, what we're seeing is an ongoing shift of particularly younger people, post-school age people coming from the regions to Sydney, a movement of older demographics back out, and then depending on that equation, some parts of the state are losing and gaining population. And that's been the story leading up to the pandemic. So then what happened in 2020 when the pandemic hit? Well, there were two critical changes to domestic migration in New South Wales. One got a lot of publicity, one didn't. The one that didn't is the top one there, which is shifts to the outflows of people from the regions, which is often forgotten. What happened with the pandemic is because of restrictions on people's movement, and I think people were scared and not moving, a lot of the people from the regions who would routinely move to Sydney for job or tertiary education opportunities didn't. Or if they did enrol in universities, they went back home very quickly and studied online. So what we had there was a stemming of the outflows from the regions, which bolstered population in those areas considerably, at least for the period of the pandemic. On top of that, you had the very well publicised process of people leaving Sydney for particularly the north and south coasts and the regions adjacent to Sydney in the Southern Highlands and Central West. Now, that's a real process. There are the crypto traders in Bellingen and whatever sort of, those stories are in the Financial Review and other places you look. But I would say its significance is easily overstated. And that's for two reasons that I've sketched up there. The first is that the places that those individuals went to were largely the same places that were benefiting from that kind of migration before. So it was an increase in migration flows, but not a dramatic change to what was happening. It was business as usual, albeit a bit more intensified. The second thing is that when we look at who was leaving Sydney during the pandemic period, we might think of the professional person in their 40s or 50s benefiting from work from home opportunities. But actually, a bigger shift than that were people in their 20s, young families with kids, who were leaving Sydney largely because of the tanking of job opportunities in Sydney through the pandemic, either going back to regions that they originated from or just moving to regions because of a cheaper cost of living set of issues. So what we have there is, I think, some interesting scenarios and stories coming out of the pandemic, but not quite the same as what you would believe if you simply read the headlines of newspaper anecdotes. Okay, so what do we see in the post-pandemic period? Obviously, it's a little bit hard to gaze into a crystal ball, and not all the data that we need is published yet. But it would seem to me that the key issue facing demographic trends in New South Wales is going to be determined in the post-pandemic period through what's decisions that are going to be made in Canberra about migration policy, international migration policy. Now, already we've seen the new government down in Canberra, I say new, they've been in power for 18 months or so, I guess, signalling a higher rate of immigration and signalling a reform to migration categories that better attune migrants to labour force needs in Australia. I think there's probably a widely held and I think legitimate critique of migration policy not necessarily meeting our labour force needs at the moment. So we're going to see that in play. I think I would be amazed if there was a reduction or a change in the priorities to regional components of the visas. So preference for migrants moving to regional areas, I think I would argue would have to be part of where the federal government might be going. But the strength of those dynamics is going to shape how many people are going to infill and boost the regions in the next few years. That's going to happen through two ways: migrants moving directly to the regions. Most international migrants move to Sydney and the other capitals, very overwhelmingly, but there is a small proportion of migrants who then end up in the regions in one way or another, or it's going to be, depending on policies relating to housing supply in Sydney, whether increased migration into Sydney will then encourage heightened out-migration of Sydney-siders fed up with cost of living and costs of housing issues and wanting to start afresh in the regions. But I think that's where we're looking at the moment. But I think the population trends will be varied across different parts of New South Wales, but I think they'll be robust in the next few years. So where are people going from? I've already talked about this in a regional sense, the coast versus inland and high amenity places. But I think there are other dynamics to that. We can cut and slice this debate in different ways. I think in terms of the population hierarchy, large regional cities down to small towns, it's increasingly the case that I think population will be settled in the larger regional cities. Certainly the Department of Planning and Environment, their settlement policies, identify fringe areas of those large regional cities, the Dubbos, the Waggas, the Alburys, etc., as the main conduits for population growth. There will be, dependent on planning and zoning restrictions, growth along the coast, although that needs to be closely managed for reasons of environment and the protection of agricultural land. I don't see these changes impacting significantly on the long-term problems of facing small towns and villages in rural New South Wales. These are hostage to bigger forces, particularly around commercial geographies, the growth of large-scale big box retailers, the shift of, the growth of Bunnings in the outskirts of places like Dubbo, basically causing hardship for local hardware stores in the main streets of smaller towns. These dynamics are going to continue to occur, except in small towns with high heritage or tourist values where they can reimagine themselves and chart new futures. These trends of population growth are manifested certainly in what's happened to the housing market. Now, the housing market has escalated. Housing prices have escalated, as we all know, and that's a story not just for regional New South Wales, but also in Sydney. But here's the ABS data on housing prices. This is for rest of New South Wales, so it does include Newcastle and Wollongong, a bit unlike some of my other data. And it's, if you're looking at the report that's been published, it's a little bit different to the comparable graph in that report because I just updated it yesterday with some new ABS data. But regardless of that, you can see, from the beginning of this series in September 2003 right up until 2020, we had the GFC, we had all these economic ups and downs in that time, but the trend was pretty solid of slow growth in housing prices in regional and rural New South Wales. And then in 2020, you had an astonishing increase. The average housing price is going from about $500,000 to $700,000 in the space of a year. That's something like a 40-odd% increase. Unparalleled, right? And there's every indication that they're going to stick around that level. Now, what's causing this? I talked about population a while ago, and that's part of what we're seeing here. But I think it's something more than that. And I think this graph, which is in the report, is a very interesting perspective. This charts, on the horizontal axis, change in population, the vertical axis, change in rural land prices, but that includes small towns and villages, right? Between 2017 and 2022, so it's the pandemic period. These are for local governments up on the North Coast. And you can see, I'm an academic, I could put a line of best fit through here, and you can see that places with higher population growth had higher housing price increases. No surprise there, and there you've got Byron on the top right-hand corner exemplifying that. But if you look at the scale here, Byron, if we just look at that for a moment, had an increase of about 7% in its population in that 5-year period. That's substantial population growth, but housing prices or rural land prices went up by about 270%. So it's not just population driving this. There are other dynamics happening very strongly. Now, what are these? Some of these have been discussed in various public debates. One is the whole issue around Airbnb, short-term rental accommodation. That's had an undeniable impact in reducing the housing stock for long-term residents. And I think there's lots of evidence that I can point you to that's referred to in the report that talks about that. And I think it's definitely a contributor. I think there are issues around land release policies. I think this is a very difficult and sensitive issue because I think there is an argument for more land release for urban settlement in places of contestation such as the North Coast, but at the same time the need to protect agricultural land and land with high biodiversity values is absolutely critical, and we've seen in this Parliament the debate over koala-related legislation over recent years, just to show sort of how hot these debates can get once you put these contestations into the foreground. But I think there is a lot of nuance to the land release policy that isn't working particularly well in my experience, in particularly northern New South Wales, which is the area I know best, that need policy attention. And I think also there is something going on more generally in the economy with assets being shifted from financial to real forms of property. So that's bolstering real estate prices, both for housing but also for agricultural land as well, which is a slightly separate story that I'd be happy to talk about. So just to finish off, in the report I then point to these trends as linking to perhaps 3 policy challenges These aren't exclusive. You know, I don't talk in the report about health policy, education policy, Indigenous affairs. We have to have some boundaries, but I thought these were the three issues that might warrant considerable debate over the next few years. I mean, the first is how do we drive jobs and economic opportunities in regional New South Wales, and what's the role of government? Now, the private sector and private investment in the market economy that we have in Australia will be the chief source of jobs and jobs, employment and investment, but government certainly has a role. At worst, government can simply pick winners. It can suggest we'll give a subsidy to this company or this industry to relocate to a particular part of the region, a particular region or a particular locality. You know, at worst, that leads to poor decision making, and if it's associated with electoral influence and can have implications in terms of loss of public support through allegations of pork barrelling. So that's sort of not the best approach to regional policy. A better approach is to use government's influence to leverage existing competitive advantage. So the idea is you work with private investors to give ancillary support in terms of infrastructure or skills or other asset development that private investors need. And there's good examples of that in New South Wales through, I've identified here the special activation precinct policies. I know of one outside of Moree where government has worked with the grains industry to develop intermodal transport infrastructure and the like, to, I think, with significant economic benefits. I was thinking the other day, just actually on the walk over, another example of that is, I think, the rail trail up in Tweed, where you've got an existing tourist base, and this, through strategic investment, adds another component of that with, I think, sizable public payoffs for the region. The problem, however, is even that policy of leveraging existing competitive advantage can be made problematic by the fact that you've got a very rapidly changing economy. I think back a couple of decades ago, if you asked businesses what their main sources of uncertainty were, it would be macroeconomic variables, interest rates, exchange rates, and the like. I think at the moment, the pace of the technological revolution, just before this presentation, we were talking about AI, which is a huge unknown for so many parts of the economy, the shift to renewables with major implications for the cost and availability of energy for different parts of the state, and I could go on and on. So the ability of governments even to leverage off existing sources of competitive advantage faces the problem of how is competitive advantage identified at a time of rapid change. The second issue, which I think is very critical, is a changing role of agriculture. In no way am I going to talk down agriculture. It's a critical part of the economy. It's vital to the economic interests of rural and regional New South Wales, but it's changing. It's changing from a preponderance of family farm enterprises to a lesser number of farm businesses, not necessarily corporate owned, often owned through family structures, but those families operate in different ways. Whereas, back in the 1950s, when the wool price soared, every town in New South Wales west of the Divide got a dividend. That process is much more uneven these days. Large farm businesses will source their inputs not necessarily from the local town, but from further afield. Sources of labour won't be their family as owner-operator enterprises. It will be, more use of wage labour. You'll be bringing people in. They don't necessarily sink their roots into the region and make expenditures in the region. They will move back out again. There is a wage labourisation of agriculture happening. I've got some stats in the report that suggest we're seeing a very rapid shift from agriculture being predominantly the sources of labour being owner-occupied family labour to wage labour. And with that comes a lot of implications for how changes and growth in agriculture then provides payoffs and regional development to parts of rural New South Wales. And finally, this will be my last slide, actually. I think the other issue, which is potentially, I think, the biggest issue of them all, is the way in which we think about rural and regional New South Wales and development in terms of the environmental, sustainability and climate change dimensions of these issues. In putting this slide together, these are words that aren't actually in the report, but in putting the slide together, I thought I'd make this point. I can remember back, being as old as I am, a couple of decades thinking about these issues, and every report on regional areas said, we want a sustainable future for our regions. It became a mantra. But to some extent, even though those sentiments were noble, it didn't really translate into concrete action. It did it on the fringes, but not centrally. I think the difference now is after the bushfires of 2019, 2020 and the floods of 2022, there is no way the climate change and sustainability aspects of regional development can be put anywhere but right at the centre of debates. Certainly that's the case most prominently in northern New South Wales. The Northern Reconstruction Fund that's been got bipartisan support as far as I understand it. It's certainly initiated by the previous government and continued by the current government here, which mandates a large-scale relocation of populations from floodplains, and the release of land settlement areas to accommodate those people is central to the fortunes of the Richmond Tweed area of New South Wales. And that's part of regional development. It's not just a climate change policy, it's a regional development policy. And increasingly those issues of do we have solutions that encourage adaptation in place, or do we have a managed retreat, moving people off floodplains or away from coastal areas endangered? Those issues are fundamental to the way in which we make decisions about land release, provision of support for different industries in terms of their economic values. And as the final bullet point there is, there are equity issues in all of this. As we found tragically in Lismore, the people who were most affected by the floods in Lismore, it was a human tragedy, full stop, but it was a human tragedy particularly as the people who were most vulnerable were most likely to live on the floodplains. And so economic development has to have that equity dimension, I would argue, in addition to issues around sustainability and climate change resilience.